If you do a quick Google search, it's really easy to find lists of the top 10 metro systems by ridership or by number of stations or by length. But I'm really interested in more of just what's the best metro system. I think it's really important to praise and to emulate systems that work really well, not just the systems that are big, which might just be a function of the metro area that they're in. Welcome to the premiere episode of Transit World, weekly videos on all things transportation with a focus on the developing world. I'm going to be judging what the best metro system is in the world based loosely on the philosophies of Jarrett Walker that he puts forward in his book, Human Transit. Walker's not necessarily the only source on this topic, but he definitely is probably the biggest name I can think of that writes specifically on what makes good public transit. So we're going with his framework. Walker outlines several different demands, so to speak, of useful service, and then talks about how transit service can actually serve those needs. Now, this is a framework that's broad just for all public transit, and so for the purposes of this analysis, we're making some assumptions that many of the components that he's outlining here would already be pretty well served just by the fact that we're talking about a metro system. So if we take out the ones that I think, at least, would be relatively consistent across all metro systems, and this is slightly controversial, but I need to get the analysis done somehow. Now we have 4 criteria, which are really boiling down for the purposes of determining what's the best subway system out there. So for this analysis, we'll be looking at coverage, frequency, span, and price. Coverage, we're simply measuring by the number of stations that a system has. This is, I think, a decent measure, or at least proxy, for the amount of access that the system provides. Certainly much better than the actual distance traveled, because it's really about the origin destinations next to the stations themselves. Frequency, obviously, is associated with Jarrett Walker perhaps the most famously. Frequency is freedom, so obviously we will be looking very closely at frequency, using here the average peak hour frequency for the trunk routes associated with each metro system. For span, we're simply looking at the number of hours in a day that the system typically runs. And for price, we'll be looking at a typical fare, but then I'm going to be indexing that based on the GDP per capita for that country. Not all of these metrics are equal, and so based on the common principles outlined by Walker, we're going to be weighting them in this way: 40% towards coverage, 30% for frequency, 20% weight towards span, and 10% for price. And before we jump into the results, a couple of notable exclusions from what we're doing here. The first is that we're only looking at the peak of service, so we're not considering the peak to base ratio or any kind of frequencies that are associated with non-peak service. We're also not considering any of the other broad factors that could make a subway system really great. So we're not looking, for example, at equity and access for people with disabilities. We're also not looking at the land uses that directly surround the different stations, nor are we looking at the connections to bus and bike pedestrian infrastructure. We're also not considering all the small details that might be associated with the user experience. You might also notice that directly missing from the list is daily ridership. Kind of really view this more as an output than an input. So it's an important metric, but not something that I think needs to directly go into the analysis here. Also, we're only looking, at least for the most part, at heavy rail metro. So excluding light rail, excluding BRT, I think those topics might get their own video, but we're going with the king of statistics on this, which is the Wikipedia article on what constitutes a metro system. So who are we including? Well, here's a Wikipedia map of all the subway systems that did make the list. We'll be including all of these. So anyway, I think that's plenty of methodology. Let's get into it. Number 10 on the list, Tokyo. A little surprised, to be honest, that Tokyo is only number 10. Given that they do have such a famous system. Main reason for this is that the system actually isn't that big compared to the others on the list as it relates to the number of stations they have. And the frequency is good, but it's not top tier, again, compared to some of the other big ones here. Number 9, Beijing. Beijing has a really big and rapidly expanding system. By many measurements, at least pre-COVID, they have the world's busiest metro. And by other accounts, they have the second busiest by route and length mileage. But the reason that they're only number 9 on the list really kind of comes down to their frequencies of service during the peak hour, which are right at about 4 minutes, which is good, but not top tier. Number 8 is Shenzhen. I've separated Shenzhen here from Hong Kong, given that there is at least technically still, a border between the two, which causes friction in transportation between the two cities. Maybe this is something that won't be that relevant in years to come, but I think right now, especially given COVID restrictions, it still is important to separate the two systems. Shenzhen is the 5th largest system in China, which is pretty impressive given that the entire system just opened in 2004. Number 7, Paris. This is our first entry on the list from Europe. Unlike Shenzhen that opened their subway just a few years ago, Paris has had theirs since 1900. In fact, it's the 4th oldest metro in Europe and one of the oldest in the world. I think maybe the Paris metro is most famous, at least in my head, for their weird themes that they have in the different stations, especially when it comes to the station entrance design. Not really my thing, but I don't know, maybe there are more people that take the system because they think it looks like a museum. Number 6, Moscow. Yet another European subway system that's famous for their extravagant interior design. The big thing I take away though from the Moscow system is that they have a unique map where there's a route that is a perfect circle on the map. As far as I know, it's the only major subway system in the world that depicts a route in a perfect circle. And it's easily recognizable to me from any other metro map you might look at. Number 5 on the list is Madrid. Is it just me, or do I feel like Madrid kind of takes a backseat to a lot of the other big metro systems that are super famous in Europe? I feel like it's a little unfair because Madrid really does have a subway system which holds its own. Excellent ridership, excellent station coverage, and for what it's worth, it has one of the highest percentages of system that is underground. Number 4, back to Asia now, going to Shanghai. I think Shanghai is most famous for its rapidly expanding system, which has been the subject of a very famous GIF recently. I also think that this is a subway system which is synonymous for the one part of the system that's not actually a conventional subway, since this is the only place in the world where you can pay to board a maglev train, which I guess is cool, even if it costs 10 times more than the actual subway system, and it only takes you halfway to downtown from the airport. So before we get to the top 3, just a quick reminder to please like and subscribe if you find this material to be somewhat interesting and not complete garbage. I also have a Patreon account if you're interested in supporting the channel, which, as you know, is really in its nascency right now. Also, a few honorable and dishonorable mentions. Mexico City ranked number 15. This was by far the highest ranking system in Latin America. Mexico City, although it didn't make the list, has really excellent headways and is an exceptionally cheap system to use for its patrons. And probably the biggest surprise that made the top 25 was Tehran, which ranked number 24. This system has decent frequencies and by far was the cheapest option out of all the subways that I examined here. Cost about 5 cents to take a ride anywhere on the Tehran subway. I think the one probably biggest dishonorable mention was Hong Kong. Hong Kong ranked number 19, which really isn't that bad in the scheme of things, but Hong Kong is, I think, so overrated. Everybody always talks about it being the best system, and this analysis really just didn't come to that conclusion. It has good frequency and span, but the system just isn't that big with less than 100 stations. Also, there were only 2 subways that made it anywhere near the top 50 on this list, which offered 24-hour service. Those 2 subways happen to be the only 2 subways from the US that made the list, New York and Chicago. I don't know if there's a cultural difference here, but I did notice that in general, the top 10 subways that ranked in terms of their span were all either in North America or Europe. Okay, back to the top 10 list. Number 3 is London. London, of course, is the oldest subway in the world, which has been open since before the Civil War concluded in the United States. It's also the most expensive on this list, even when you adjust for per capita GDP. Number 2 on the list is the only city from North America that made it in the top 10, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is New York. New York, of course, is by far the best system that we have in the US by leaps and bounds, and it actually does punch its weight quite well on the international scale. It has pretty much the largest coverage you can find anywhere in terms of number of stations. And even though its peak annual ridership was all the way back in 1946, it still maintains a great ridership, especially given the context of the North American land uses that surround the metro area. And number 1 was Seoul, South Korea. Seoul and New York were essentially a statistical tie. They both have roughly equivalent numbers of stations, depending on exactly what you count and don't. But Seoul beats them out with slightly better frequencies. Not only did Seoul rank number 1 in the quick back of the envelope analysis I'm presenting right here, but they had all sorts of other little details which I think would give them the brownie points to get them to the top, even if they didn't rank number 1 here. They do all sorts of stuff that I think every subway system should and can do without that much effort. They have a jingle they play when they're approaching a transfer station, so you know when you're coming up to an important spot. They have double doors at most stations to improve safety. The mapping is also just incredible. The line maps tell you not only what side the doors will open on at your station, but also the optimal door that you should be taking to transfer most optimally when you get to the transfer station. The station maps also have a really good system where they number every single one of the exits, and it's really clearly demarcated throughout the system exactly what exit you're going towards and how to get to other ones. Plus, just look at their system map. How can you possibly look at this map and not think that this is the best subway on earth? So anyway, that's my top 10 list. I'll leave the full results on the screen here if you'd like to pause and look through the details. One interesting note to conclude on here is that out of the 10 largest cities in the world by metro population, only 3 made this list. In fact, there are some cities in the top 10, like Jakarta and Lagos, number 2 and number 8 in population respectively, which don't have any subway system at all. So I think maybe that will be the topic of a video to come. That's it for today. Thanks for sitting through the first and undoubtedly most awkward chapter of Transit World, which I will ever produce. I appreciate your patronage here, and again, please feel free if you like the material and want to see more to send me a like and a subscribe, and perhaps even check out my Patreon. Appreciate it. Until next time.